Well, hello, friends. Welcome back to Embrace the Question. This is Steve, and it is our time to get back into the Word. We're doing Bible study with me, and I'm the me that you're doing the Bible study with. I appreciate you stopping by. I hope that maybe some of you are first timers. If you are, welcome, and I invite you to subscribe and go along on the journey with us. We are only in Genesis. So that bodes well. We have a lot of ground yet to cover. You haven't missed much. We're in Genesis chapter 16. Last week we did the covenant between God and Abraham, which God didn't exactly let Abraham participate in. Abraham got to witness with his sleeping eyes open and noticed that God walked the blood path for him. So if you have not seen that particular video, I invite you to go back 1 week and check out the video on Genesis 15, the covenant with Abraham. Here we are, chapter 16, and the plot thickens. We are getting a little bit impatient, I think, with God. We know that the promise is threefold. I'm going to give you a lot of land. I'm going to give you a lot of descendants. And I am going to bless you greatly. But Abraham hasn't seen any kids yet. And you know how that might be, because he's in his 80s, right? His lovely wife, Sarai, is in her 70s. I don't know. I don't know that I would be any less impatient. Yeah, when you get a promise like this from God, God says to Abram, you're my guy. I am going to bless you very much. And Abraham approaches him and says, finally, yes, but I don't have any kids. And this guy who I picked up in Damascus, he's going to be my heir. And God says, no, this guy is not going to be your heir. That's Eleazar of Damascus. He won't be your heir. I'm going to take care of that. And then silence for a long time, a very long time. We're talking years. This is some years now after that covenant. Well, Abram says to God, how will I know how do I really know? Give me a sign. Not that I don't believe you, but I need something to go on here because there are other people in my life that I have to live with and listen to constantly. And we need to know that this is a thing, a real thing. And God says, okay, Abram, then I'm going to make you this covenant. And the covenant took place as the proof. Maybe what you and I would have thought good proof would consist of. Steve, you're going to have many, many kids, as of the sands of the sea, your descendants will be. And you're going to die a ripe old age, full of years. That's kind of sounds like the promise that Abraham was made. Okay, so then when do we get started here? Okay, here's what I expect to see. I expect to see for myself maybe, let's say 5 kids. I'll have 5 kids. And those 5 kids are going to grow up and they're going to marry 5 spouses, and they in turn will have 5 kids each. Okay, so now all of a sudden I have 25 grandkids, and those 25 grandkids are going to grow up. Maybe this is all happening within a 40-year period. Those 5 grandkids are going to grow up, or 25 grandkids. They're going to grow up and pick 25 spouses, and they're going to each have 5 kids. I'm 40 years older, but I can see that I have 75 grandkids, great grandkids, 25 grandkids, 5 kids, That's pretty good proof. I mean, I can see how God's doing a thing, right? I'm multiplying. My house on Christmas is full. You guys need to bring your own dish because I ain't covering all of that. That is a lot of kids. Well, that didn't happen. Nothing was happening. No such luck for Abram. So God says, I'm giving you this covenant. I'm going to cut it right in front of you, and that's going to have to be enough. And I think it was for a good long while. But again, years are passing. And I have a wife, Sarai, that is getting older. And she's starting to wonder, you know what? I don't know if you really heard God, or if we really heard God, or if He really intended for us to just stand by and wait. These are the questions that I think, would all have. I don't know if He really intended for us to just stand around and wait. And remember, both of these guys, Abram, Sarai, both of them in the Faith Hall of Fame chapter of Hebrews 11. So whatever we're seeing here, God is saying these guys are pretty good on faith. Pretty good. Better than your norm on faith. That's pretty neat. So, okay, let's see where this story goes. We'll start with chapter 16. Now, Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. She had a female Egyptian servant whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said to Abram, Behold, now the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go in to my servant. It may be that I shall obtain children by her. And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. So after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar the Egyptian, her servant, and gave her to Abram her husband as a wife. And he went in to Hagar, and she conceived, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. That is, Hagar looked upon Sarai with contempt. And Sarai said to Abram, May the wrong done to me be on you. I gave my servant to you. I gave my servant to your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me. All right, let's take those 5. Do a little bit of fleshing that out, okay? Abram's wife, Sarai, was barren. There are a lot of scriptures having to do with those that are barren. Note that anything that we see here then as a birth is going to be miraculous. That lines us up with several in Scripture, does it not? One that comes to mind is Samuel's mother, Hannah. She was barren, and the Lord gave her one. She was also looked upon with contempt by her servants, her maidservants. Good story, 1 Samuel. We might realize that we're being set up for comparison to another miraculous birth. Okay? That might even be the birth of the Messiah. Okay? So we'll keep that in mind as we go. But Sarai is barren. She has a female Egyptian servant whose name is Hagar. What's the big deal about an Egyptian servant? Well, Egypt, every time Egypt comes into play, we're going to immediately think of bondage, of servitude, of slavery, of sin. These are all the synonyms that come to mind whenever we start talking about Egypt, because Egypt, the story hasn't totally developed yet by this time, but we're getting there pretty quickly, and we will be there by the next chapter. So we know that Egypt is not necessarily a great thing to have in our own personal story. It means that we're trapped into something typically that we can't get out of easily, okay, i.e. slavery. So we have Hagar. And Hagar is a servant. So we have sin, Egypt, as a servant. That's an interesting concept because if we go backwards here to Genesis chapter, is it 4? I believe it is. Verse 7, God's conversation with Cain. If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin, Egypt, is crouching at the door. Its desire is contrary to you, and you have to rule over Egypt. You cannot let Egypt rule over you. So now we're seeing perhaps a picture that we had not seen before. Let's go back to 16. But we have Hagar. And Sarah is just jumping the gun a little bit. Maybe this is the plan. Maybe it's up to me to devise a way to see this promise of God through. So she says to Abram, maybe you and Hagar ought to go hang out some evening, and we'll see if maybe she can obtain children on my behalf. I'm interested in the wording here. Sarah says to Abraham, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Had the Lord prevented her from bearing children? Whether he had or had not is not really the point. The view is that no matter what happens to me, it's God's fault. We see that a lot in the writings of the Pentateuch, Old Testament writings, period. See it in Job. Job has this opinion that not only does good come from God, but evil comes from God. This was just the way people thought. God was in such a place that he dictated all things good or bad for anyone. There was no villain to really blame the bad on other than God. So Sarai's view was, God's not letting me have kids. She didn't really have a grid for God's just not given me kids yet. Well, the scripture says Abram listened to Sarai. I'm sure that was quite the chore, don't you think? Trying to convince her husband to sleep with her handmaid. Well, she managed. And Abram, it says, had lived 10 years already in this land of promise. And Sarai, his wife, gave Hagar, the Egyptian, to Abram to be a second wife. He goes in, she conceives, she begins to lord that over Sarai. We see that again in the wives of Jacob, the grandkids, right? We're going to see that with Rachel and Leah. It's interesting how all of this tends to repeat. Well, Sarah gets angry and takes it out on Abram because naturally it's his fault. She forgets that it was her idea in the first place, but she is angry and she's hurt, and there is nowhere to run for Abram. So Abram says to Sarai, behold, your servant is in your power. Do to her as you please. Then Sarai dealt harshly with Hagar, and she fled. Hagar fled. The angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, the spring on the way to Shur. And he said, Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going? Isn't that interesting? The way that God always questions us in the middle of whatever we are in. He did this to Elijah. Elijah, what are you doing? Elijah's running. He's running. He's running from Jezebel because his spirit finally snapped and he's just frightened. So he's running, and the angel meets him and says, what are you doing? He's so beyond himself, he just keeps running, and he runs some more, and he runs some more, and finally he passes out. When he comes to, the angel's sitting there and goes, what are you doing? It's always that bit of introspection that God wishes us to take upon ourselves. What exactly are you freaking out about right now? Why are you in the place you're in? Well, he finds her by a spring, by a well in the wilderness, and he says, "Where have you come from, and where are you going?" As if he did not know. And she says, "I'm fleeing from my mistress Sarai." And the angel of the Lord said to her, "Return to your mistress and submit to her." The angel of the Lord also said to her, "I will surely multiply your offspring so that they cannot be numbered for multitude." Okay, you might be asking yourself, why? She's just a servant girl. But she was also in the house of Abram, the one who's got this covenant. So Abram's covenant is bigger, as we can already see. It's bigger than just him. There's pieces of it that come into play even when Abram messes up. Abram has taken the whole prophecy into his own hands, and he's trying to make things happen when he's not supposed to be over any of that. It's not his job to make these things happen. It's not Sarai's job to make the prophecies fulfill. And yet they try it. They get into trouble. Hagar is fleeing for her life. She's probably in a bad spot in the middle of the desert, and things look pretty hopeless for her. But the Lord meets her. Why? Because she came from the house of Abram. It's the covenant. Because she is from Abram's house, because she is bearing someone from Abram, from his loins, then she is going to be blessed. She is going to be taken care of. And she is promised, "I will surely multiply your offspring so they cannot be numbered for multitude." Quite a promise for someone who is picked up in a slave market in Egypt, is it not? She had no idea what she was getting into. So verse 11, "And the angel of the Lord said to her, Behold, you are pregnant and shall bear a son. You'll call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has listened to your affliction. He shall be a wild donkey of a man, his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he shall dwell over against all his kinsmen." You know, that's, I'm going to stop right there. This idea of Ishmael as coming from Egypt. I'm thinking of Hagar as a picture of Egypt. And what comes from Egypt is wild. And everyone is against this man that is going to be named Ishmael. Ishmael, we can look at what his name means. "And shalt call his name Ishmael, God will hear." The name of Abram's oldest son and five Israelites. Ishmael. Ishmael means God will hear. The idea is that she was alone in the wilderness, was Hagar, and God heard her weeping, heard her moaning, heard her grief, and God did not abandon her. So this son of yours, this doesn't sound like all this great news, really, does it? I mean, she's not in a good mood. She's a long ways from home. She's run away. She's going to have to go back. She's going to have to submit to a not very nice mistress in Sarah. He's telling her that, well, you've conceived a son. You're going to name him Ishmael because of God being able to hear you in your grief. And he's not going to be well received by his brothers, but he is going to be quite the man. There are going to be many come from him. A wild donkey of a man. How do you like that description? His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. And he will dwell over against all his kinsmen. Who are his kinsmen going to be? Well, that would be someone that Abram doesn't really have a knowledge of yet, because Abram has jumped the gun. Abram has tried to solve this problem himself. While he's come up with a son, or at least a pregnant servant to be his wife, he still doesn't really know what God meant by "I am going to bless you indeed and give you many descendants." So in verse 13, Hagar calls the name of the Lord. So she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, "You are a God of seeing." For she said, "Truly here I have seen him who looks after me. He looks after me." Therefore the well was called Bir Lahai Roi. It lies between Kadesh and Bered. And Hagar bore Abram a son. Abram called the name of his son, whom Hagar bore, Ishmael. And Abram is 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to Abram. It's difficult for me not to want to push way ahead here, but Abram is only 86. When Isaac, the son of the promise, is born, he will be 99. So he's got another 13 years to wait, and guess what? Those 13 years aren't full of a whole lot of reminders. Abram's going to have to cling to the word that he's already had. He's going to have to cling to this promise that I'm going to have a lot of kids. Apparently, they're not going to come through Ishmael. And I don't know what I'm going to do because I am faced with a physical impossibility. Right? Let's take another look at Paul's description of what's going on here. Okay? That would be in Galatians chapter 4. Let's go down here to verse 21. And Paul writes, "Tell me, you who desire to be under the law, do you not listen to the law? For it is written that Abraham had two sons, one by a slave woman and one by a free woman. But the son of the slave was born according to the flesh, while the son of the free woman was born through promise. Now this may be interpreted allegorically." I love that when he break it down like this. "These women are two covenants. One is from Mount Sinai, bearing children for slavery. She is Hagar. Now Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia. She corresponds to the present Jerusalem, for she is in slavery with her children. But the Jerusalem above is free, and she is our mother. For it is written, 'Rejoice, O barren one who does not bear. Break forth and cry aloud, you who are not in labor. For the children of the desolate one will be more than those of the one who has a husband.' Now you, brothers, like Isaac, are children of promise." This is some pretty powerful verses. It really starts to put some things into perspective for us. We can see the difference between what it looks like to operate through the flesh, the realm of the flesh, Hagar, and what it might look like to wait on God and operate through the realm of promise and glory, Isaac. Two different things, two different outcomes. And because we tend to not wait on God, we tend to take matters into our own hands, the fleshly outcome becomes a real pain for us. To try to self-fulfill our own promises through fleshly means becomes a snare and a pain in the flesh for us. Ishmael was going to be against all his kinsmen, and he was going to be a multitude. So what we have here, Abram, is a huge dysfunctional family that is still a family, still blessed because it's through you, but you've introduced a lot of contention into things because you listened again to Sarai, who was trying to make something happen, and you were all too willing. So this is an interesting story. A lot of parallels with a lot of other stories that we know, some that we've seen, Genesis 1, 2, 3, 4, some that we haven't seen yet. So I hope you're enjoying this. That is all. We can drill down pretty deeply into a lot of this symbology, the symbolism that we see here. If it weren't for the likes of Paul, who really makes it very clear for us here, it would take us a little bit maybe to come up with the fact that we're dealing with two covenants, one Sinai and one Jerusalem, one a grace covenant. Okay? If that doesn't all make sense, well, just hang in there. It will. We'll get to it and we'll try to shed light on it. Leave your questions and comments down below. Always like to hear from you. Always like to read your take on everything. And hey, I'll see you next week. Genesis chapter 17. We are getting there, aren't we? We're getting there. Till next time, peace.